So our next speaker is Andrew Halestrap, who's Emeritus Professor of Biochemistry at Bristol University and a former chair of the group Christians in Science, which he'll tell us a bit about, and is very well qualified as a scientist and a Christian to tell us about how we can support and make use of scientists in congregations. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Well, just a little bit about Christians in Science before I get on to the main part of the talk. Whoops, a bit fast. We're an international and cross-denominational network of those concerned with the relationship between science and the Christian faith. We're open to professional scientists, and indeed we're the main support body for Christians who are scientists. But we're also very open to teachers, students, and anybody with an interest in science and faith. And in fact, we're trying to widen that group because I think it's really important to have some resources and so on for the average person in the pew. And we actually do that. Keith Fox, who was my predecessor, who spoke to us yesterday, initiated these being a Christian... sorry, I've gone too far. Where's it gone? I've lost a slide here. That's the ones I want. God, they've got mixed up. The Thinking About leaflets, which are written by mainstream scientists who are also Christians, and give a view of the various areas in terms of science and faith that people might be concerned about. Everything from the interpretation of Genesis, evolution, disasters, gene embryos. There's 16 of them, and a lot of them are on display over on the piano, and I've got 4 or 5 packs which have them all in. But there's also app cards which you can look them all up. They're all available online. But these are really useful resource for the average Christian in the pew who's not an expert but wants to get clued up. We've also got these books that are designed, little leaflets that are designed more for students who are entering the sciences at university and the particular issues that they may face as Christians in those sciences. And again, they're really useful. They're written in combination with a senior academic and a research student, trying to get the perspective that both might be interested in. And as I say, we have apps which you can get onto our website where there's a huge number of resources available. So it's a really good place to look for. Now, what I'm really going to try and do this morning is to explain to you why I think that science is a Christian vocation, and that we are called, some of us, to be scientists and to be Christians within that science. And I think that scientists in congregations can benefit enormously from scientists in congregation can benefit the life and teaching of the churches enormously, because we can, we're in a sense qualified to be able to talk about science, but we're also Christians, so we can bring the two together. And I think it's really important that churches recognize that and use that possibility. In fact, Christians in Science has scientists all around who are Christians all around the country who you can call on to give talks and lead things. Unfortunately, many of us who are scientists and Christians find that churches don't always make us feel welcome, because we can sometimes think we're a bit of a threat. There's still that science and faith in conflict in some churches. You believe in evolution? Oh dear. And so they don't always make us as welcome as we'd like, and we're very, very keen to help to dispel that conflict narrative. Of course, it's also true, and I think this is important for church leadership to understand, that scientists also feel alienated sometimes in their workplace, because being a Christian in the scientific workplace can be quite difficult. It can be a fairly threatening environment. A lot of people are quite antagonistic, if not hostile, to the Christian faith. And if we're not supported in the churches and we feel under threat at work, it can be quite a difficult life. Another reason why we have Christians in Science, to support one another. So I'm going to start with a personal story, because I actually think a personal story of a Christian who's doing research in the sciences can be a great help in the church setting as people begin to understand the life of a scientist and how they've got to grips with their faith and their science. So I'm unashamedly going to do a little bit of a personal story to begin with. I'm going to look at my early Christian and scientific foundations, some of the guiding principles that I've applied in my own thinking as a Christian and as a scientist. And I'm going to look a little bit at my scientific career and just give you a few minutes of real science, because that's what it's all about. It's exciting. And then I'm going to look at what special opportunities does being a Christian in science bring to serve God in both the church and in wider society. That's part of my Christian vocation as a scientist. And then look at how churches can better support and use scientists in their congregations. A few practical thoughts that might aid our discussion later. Now, I was very fortunate. I was brought up in this lovely house in Devon, in Tiverton, and I was part of a Christian family. My parents were very committed Christians, and so my Christian faith was there from square one. I think I was reading the Bible with Scripture Union notes from the age of 5. I think it was called Honeycomb or something in those days. But I was also very fortunate. My parents allowed me to explore, and my scientific genes, I suppose you could call them, were there from the very beginning. And we had a big cellar in that house, and I had a chemistry set there. And my chemistry set was better than anybody else's because my father, being a dentist, could go down to the local pharmacist and get anything I asked him for, which was very good. I did some pretty hair-raising experiments. I made explosives and fireworks. I'd be arrested today. My most unsuccessful experiment was when I tried to do electrolysis. I'd read about it. I was about 11 or 12. I'd read about it. You put 12 volts into water, and you get oxygen and hydrogen coming off. I thought, come on, 12 volts. Let's use mains electricity. Unfortunately, it blew the whole mains fuse box in the house. My father's dental equipment stopped. I was not very popular. Anyway, but science has been in my blood from a very early stage. I had a very privileged education. I went to a great school where I had some superb science teachers. One of my teachers had a PhD in biochemistry, which is my own topic. He was a Christian. And he really, I think, did more than any other teacher to inspire me. And in fact, I still keep in touch with him. He became professor of botany at Vancouver University. He was a very, very bright guy. And it had a huge effect. I then went to Cambridge. I was at Sydney Sussex College. And there, I think, as well as the science, which I enjoyed, I studied natural sciences, specializing in biochemistry. But I was very influenced there by the Christian Union, and my Christian faith sort of really took off there. And I started thinking for myself and getting to know Scripture better. And that was a very, very important part of my development. I didn't realize then just how privileged I was hearing great speakers like John Stott regularly, Now, some of the guiding principles that from very early on I've had as I've approached my science and my faith, it's really summarized in all truth is God's truth. But you can go right back to Augustine of Hippo, and he said, let every good and true Christian understand that wherever truth may be found, it belongs to his master. And I've always felt this very much, that scientific truth and, if you like, religious truth are all from God. Of course, other people have said similar things. This is Francis Bacon. You probably know this. God has laid before us 2 books or volumes to study if we will be free from error. First, the Scriptures revealing the will of God, and then the creatures expressing his power. And actually, he was plagiarizing a bit, wasn't he, from Psalm 19, which is a psalm in 2 halves. We didn't have it in the service this morning, but I would call that the scientist's psalm, in a sense. And it comes in 2 halves. The first half is very much the book of God's works and looking at creation, and the second part is the book of God's words. And so we have the heavens declare the glory of God, the Lord, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And as a scientist, I feel this very much. As I study God's world, I'm able to worship God because his glory is there in creation. But then the second half is very much about Scripture. And the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. And I've always had a very high view of Scripture, that it is God's inspired word. And yet, because they're both God's truth, I do not believe they will be in conflict if properly understood. And that has been an absolutely vital part of my development as a Christian and as a scientist. And this idea of worshipping God, of course, was there from the very beginning of, I suppose call it the beginning of experimental science. I mean, the big rise of experimental science, the people like Galileo and Kepler and Newton were very much aware that their science was exploring God's world. And in doing so, it was a part of their worship, their understanding this wonderful God They saw no conflict at all between their science and faith. And the sort of catchword verse from Psalm 111, verse 2, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in him. As we look at it, we worship God. We think, what a wonderful creator we have. One of my heroes is James Clerk Maxwell, who set up the Cavendish Laboratories of Physics here in Cambridge. They were established in 1874. And he was a very, very keen and learned Christian. He was also precociously bright. He published, I think he gave his first paper to the Royal Society when he was still at school, if I remember rightly. And he formulated the classical theory of electromagnetic radiation, bringing together for the first time electricity, magnetism, and light as a manifestation of the same phenomena. Absolutely amazing stuff. And Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism have been called the second great unification of physics, after the first one realized by Isaac Newton, another polymath. But he was a very keen Christian. The laboratories he set up have had 29 Nobel Prizes since they were set up, with one more this year. Amazing. But when he set up the laboratories, he insisted on putting above the door, and you probably know this, that verse from Psalm 111, verse 2, in Latin. But when they moved to the newer laboratories in the sort of early 1970s, one of the PhD students working there asked, he was a Christian, he asked, would they put those verses on the new entranceway to the laboratories? And much to his amazement, they did. And there it is now in the, above. That's a typical, it's a bit like I was at that sort of era. That's the early 70s, all with their sports jackets and ties. You won't find that in the laboratory today. Interesting, the person who asked for that is he's a professor of nanosciences at Oxford, and he is the husband of the Secretary of Christians in Science. A bold move as a young PhD student. Now, the other guiding principle that really has been absolutely fundamental to my own way of thinking, and again, this will probably be familiar territory, but I think it's worth rehearsing, and this is exactly the sort of thing that I as a scientist would do in a congregation when I was asked to talk. And that is to make sure people understand that science and faith are complementary ways of viewing the world. They are not in conflict at all. And so, very simply put, and it's always best to start simply, science asks the question how God works in the world and investigates this by experimentation, whereas religion, in a simplistic sense, asks the ultimate questions of why, of purpose and meaning. They're complementary. And we have many areas of life where we don't see any problems with things being complementary. They're just two ways of looking at the same thing. Johann Kepler has put it beautifully, and many of you will know this, but it's such a perfect way of expressing it. Scientists are thinking God's thoughts after him. They're understanding how God works. They're not denying he's working. He is, if you like, the ultimate purpose who gives meaning, but we're understanding how he works. And the other thing that we have is, I think as a Christian, and I feel very strongly, is that we understand that our Creator God is not fickle. He's created an ordered universe that behaves consistently. And that is what allows us as scientists to investigate his world by experimentation. We depend, as scientists, on the consistency of the universe, the laws of nature, if we're able to carry out research. It would be very difficult if sometimes you dropped an apple and it dropped down, and sometimes it went up. I mean, it would be an impossible world. And we believe as Christians that those scientific laws are part of God's injection of meaning into the world. And that's, to me, fundamental. And of course, those results of the knowledge that we gain through our experiments, our scientific investigation, is part of being God's stewards of the creation. Because as we understand the world better, we can use our knowledge for the better benefit of humanity. Of course, it can be misused, but there are so many ways in which our understanding derived by science can be part of our stewardship of God's creation. That has been fundamental to me. And again, I think that's something I always want to get across when I talk to congregations, the positive impact of science that can be used in stewardship. Now, I always like, when I'm talking about science and faith, to stress this complementarity and not contradiction. And I often use this example here. This is Harry Potter having his first kiss. And I will tell you that a kiss, scientifically, is the pressing together of two pairs of lips with the mutual exchange of saliva and bacteria. It is technically called osculation. How many of you have come across the word osculation? A few of you have. Good. Well, that's what it is. Now, that, of course, says nothing really about what is behind a kiss, which is the emotion, the love, and so on. The two are totally complementary. Neither is right or wrong. They together give a full description. I'm surprised. I don't know if you've given your example yet, Ruth, have you? You have. I won't do the kettle one then again. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, I can give you a very long scientific explanation, but I want a cup of tea. So that's been underlying all of my thinking as I've worked through my science. These are the sort of principles that I have. God is the ultimate cause, but he works through processes that the scientist understands. There's no conflict. The other thing that I've felt very strongly is that God is constantly at work in his universe, and this came out yesterday, as both the architect and designer, if you like, but also constantly at work, the workman. And this is theism. We're theists as Christians. We're not deists. He didn't just set it up and go away and have a cup of tea and let it run. And I think that's really important. And again, this verse came yesterday, but I think this is so important for me as a Christian, that his ongoing activity as described in Hebrews 1:3. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. And I guess a person who helped me a lot in thinking through this sort of thing was C.S. Lewis. In a way, I suppose what he was saying, and I certainly feel, is that the Christian faith provides an integrated and wonderfully satisfying worldview that not only makes sense of the scientific endeavour, but provides a better intellectual framework for the living and hope for the future. And that, to me, is fundamental. And he put it, you may know this quote, but I think it's a wonderful one. This is C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I think that's a really beautifully expressed way of putting it. Sorry.
Those are the words that are on his memorial in Westminster Abbey.
Is it? Thank you. Because I think they've been, I hadn't read them until Alistair McGrath's biography and then came across them. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my own scientific career. Because again, I find if I go into churches, schools or whatever, and I talk a little bit about my science and get them inspired in science, and then I say, and I'm a Christian and why I'm a Christian, the fact that I've talked about my science and got them enthused about that makes a big difference. I have credibility. So I'm unashamedly going to talk a little bit about my science. I began my PhD in Bristol after my time in Cambridge. I worked with a guy called Dick Denton, who's both a Fellow of the Royal Society and a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. And I worked on the regulation of fat synthesis in epididymal fat pads by insulin. Now, you may think that's a bit obscure. I wonder if some of you here will know what the epididymis is, but you'll probably certainly know what didymus is, because Thomas Didymus was the twin. And epididymis means that it's the twin alongside the testicle, it's the twins, and it's the fat pads that go alongside the testicles. And the reason it's great for a scientist is you've got two of them, matched pairs. You can treat one with insulin and a control. And this statistically is wonderful. You get much tighter statistics. So that's what I worked on. I made a few little discoveries there, which were quite satisfying. But whilst I was working there, I was also working with Pfizer on anti-obesity drugs. And I came across a compound which turned out to be my meal ticket for the rest of my scientific career. And essentially, it was something that did inhibit fat synthesis, but the way it did it, I'm going to explain in a moment, it was not what we were expecting. And it led me down a whole load of paths. And one of the things that I think people don't always understand about science is that you never know quite where you're going in research. It's like Pandora's box. You know, you discover one thing and it leads you somewhere else, and that develops a new question for you to ask, and you go on and on. And my career has taken a very interesting sort of direction. I did quite a lot in fat metabolism, but that took me into diabetes, into cancer, and into heart disease. And I've worked on all of these areas over the many years. And through serendipity, I discovered how metformin works, which is the drug that several million people take every day for type 2 diabetes. And my research led me, I would never have believed it, but it led me to discover how that worked. It's my most cited paper. It took me 3 years to get it published because nobody believed it. It's now the accepted mechanism. But you never know where it's going, but it's very exciting when you get there. The trouble is you're often excited before the rest of the scientific world catches up, which can be difficult. So what was my discovery that really led me down this direction? And I'm going to do some real biochemistry with you. I'm unashamedly simple, but real. This bit up here is a cell membrane of any cell. Here's the blood outside, and this is the inside of the cell. And there are processes that get things like glucose in and out of the cell. They're like very specific gates in the membrane. Now, inside the cell, the glucose is converted into a substance called pyruvate. So lots of steps there. Now, in a lot of cells, particularly white muscle, which is the one you use when you're sprinting, that pyruvate gets converted to lactic acid. And I bet most of you have heard of lactic acid, because it's when you do a lot of exercise, it builds up in your muscle. And that's what causes you fatigue. Well, when I lecture on this, I sometimes get the students out to do press-ups until they can do no more. That's the lactic acid building up. Or when you go fishing, if you do, you play a fish until the lactic acid has built up so much they can't do anything more. Now, I discovered how lactic acid gets out of cells. It's a transport mechanism, another specific gate. The drug that I discovered in Pfizer turned out to block this process. So that was quite an important thing to discover. But what's more, it did something else. In a lot of cells, probably the majority, this can all be done without oxygen. Whereas in cells that are using oxygen, this pyruvate goes into the powerhouses of the cell that burn the fuel, the mitochondria. And they go into that cell, into that mitochondria through another membrane, and it too has to have a specific gate, a transport mechanism. And the pyruvate goes in, and inside it gets converted to carbon dioxide and water. It's burnt. Turns out that my inhibitor also blocked this. Neither of these two have been discovered before, so in one fell swoop, in a few weeks' work, I discovered two rather important things, and that's why it was my meal ticket for the rest of my life. Well, almost. Now, it turns out that these processes here are involved in many different areas of metabolism, and I won't go into them, but they're involved in fat synthesis, they're involved in making sugars in the liver, it's all over the place, making fats. So they are very important. In the brain, they're vital for energy metabolism. Now, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit how we study these things, because this is quite fascinating. Here is our, this is going to be lactic acid transport out of cells. And the glucose goes in, it gets converted to lactic acid, and it comes out on this transport mechanism. We were able to discover what the protein was. We know a lot about its structure, how it works. It turns out part of it here is the receptor for the malarial parasite. That was a serendipitous, we'd never have guessed that, but it turns out that malarial parasite binds to that bit. But how do we study this lactic acid transport? Well, this is an African clawed toad, Xenopus levis. Now, years ago, when they did pregnancy testing, they used to use that female toad because urine from a pregnant woman would cause that toad to ovulate. And that's how it used to be done until we had much more fancy techniques. Well, now the eggs from this thing are huge. And what we can do with those eggs is we can put the DNA that encodes this protein inside the egg. It doesn't normally have this transport mechanism, but if we put the DNA in, we can make it express it. So now we can study lactic acid transport into this egg. And we can do it by trapping inside this egg a fluorescent dye, a colored dye that gives off colored light when you shine another color of light on it. And why is that so important? Well, you can study this transport in real time. You can put on lactic acid, you get a signal change, take it off, and it comes back out. And that's really fantastic. If you then have an inhibitor, and we're working with AstraZeneca now, we have a very powerful inhibitor that binds here. When you now add lactic acid, nothing happens. It's a very good way of detecting inhibitors. This is an incredibly potent inhibitor, and AstraZeneca has developed it as a cancer treatment, and it will kill cancer cells. I don't think it's going to probably make it to the market because there are always problems, but it's a very potent killer in the laboratory animal of cancer cells. So that gives you a flavour of the sort of research. The other thing I've done a lot of work on is the heart, in recent years particularly, and what happens when you have a heart attack. And when you have a heart attack, you have a clot here, and the clot stops the blood going down to the rest of the heart, and that heart becomes ischemic, and because it becomes ischemic, it starts dying. What happens when you go into hospital? Nowadays, they tend to do a process called angioplasty, where they put a fine fibre up either from your groin or up from your wrist in the arteries, and it comes in through these coronary arteries here to get rid of that block. And then you get rid of the block, and you restore the flow of blood. Now, it turns out that when you restore the flow of blood, you can get extra damage. It's called, for the experts, reperfusion injury. And that's really interested me, because it turns out that reperfusion injury involves a mitochondria. Now, I haven't really got time to do all this, but I'm going to just show you the sort of kit that we use. I can't give you too much, but this is the heart going on to the cannula, and it will actually beat on that cannula outside of the animal. And what we can do here is to shine a very powerful light and study what's going on inside the heart in real time. So we can actually study particularly what's happening to these mitochondria, the powerhouses, in real time. That little thing going in now is a pressure transducer. It will detect the actual work being done by the heart as it pumps. So you can study how well the heart is functioning in real time at the same time as you're studying what's going on inside. Now, to cut a long story short, you can also study isolated heart cells, which are very beautiful. But the thing that really interests us is that what goes wrong, what kills the heart when you bring the blood back, if the clot is there for too long, is these mitochondria here, the powerhouses of the cell. Instead of being the positive making energy, they go into reverse and start killing the cell. And we've discovered what the mechanism is, and we have drugs and protocols that will prevent it, and therefore give you a bigger window of opportunity to recover after a heart attack, or indeed heart surgery, where you have to stop the heart. So there you go. That's a bit about research. What about the challenges of being a Christian and a scientist? What have I faced? What do others face? And I think it's important for church leadership to realize it is a challenging job being a scientist and a Christian. We have to balance the demands of a career in science while maintaining an active role in the church and having time for family and friends. And actually, science is very demanding, especially at the highest levels. Getting grants, getting papers written, running a research group, it's quite difficult. And as I mentioned already, churches don't always make it any easier because they don't understand science and they feel a bit threatened by it. And sometimes I've known people who've given up on church because they haven't felt welcomed, which is tragic. What about the opportunities it brings? What's distinctive about being a Christian, and what opportunities does it bring to serve God? I think the first thing I've touched on already, that actually if we're mainstream scientists and we're Christians, we're the best place to challenge the pervading atheism in the scientific world. Because people can't say, well, you're just religious, you don't understand science. You know, you've got the credentials to prove that you're a proper scientist. And as a Christian, you can span that gap. And you have far more credibility than a theologian or a vicar who's studied classics. I mean, they may be extremely articulate and well-informed, but they're not scientists, and they don't have the same credibility. And I think it's important, therefore, to use scientists in congregations because of that credibility. We can do things with real knowledge, pointing out just what an improbable world we live in, and why it may well reflect the work of a creator who reveals himself through creation. One of the things I find really interesting as a scientist is how often my scientific colleagues use the word designed when they're talking about their research. They say, this protein is designed for this. Of course, I don't believe it's designed, but it looks as if it's designed. Or I'm sitting down over a cup of coffee with a colleague, one particular colleague, my ex-PhD student, who's not a Christian. He respects my faith, but he's not a Christian. He'll sometimes say when we're thinking through a problem, if I was God, how would I have done it? He doesn't believe in God, but it's as if it's designed. And I could say, well, actually, maybe there is a creator behind this. One of the reasons, though, that scientists don't like, and it's important to understand this, why they don't like introducing the concept of God is because of this Occam's razor principle. It goes back to this Franciscan friar back in the 14th century, William of Ockham. It is vain to do with more what can be done with fewer, or the simplest hypothesis to fit the facts is the best. And they will say to me, well, look, actually, you're introducing an extra complexity which is not testable. Therefore, it's a more complex hypothesis. Therefore, I should reject it, Occam's razor. Well, on face value, that seems quite reasonable. But what I often say to people is based on some very good thinking of Keith Ward, amongst others. That actually, scientists recognize the improbabilities of the world. The Big Bang is incredibly improbable. Evolution in the timescale is incredibly improbable. How did life arise? Incredibly improbable. And you can talk about multiverses and all sorts of things to make it appear to be more probable. But at the end of the day, scientists recognize we're in a very improbable universe. So what Keith Ward says is, well, what if, as a Christian, you say there is a single incomprehensible mystery, which is the existence of God, but that offers an explanation for all the other incredibly improbable events. So you have one improbable mystery instead of lots, which is the simpler hypothesis. It's not a proof, but I find it quite a helpful way of talking to my colleagues, and indeed in the church context. I think another thing that Christians who are mainstream scientists are best placed to do is to help their fellow Christians to see that science is not a threat to be resisted, it's not an enemy to be defeated, but a friend to be embraced as we seek to make God known in the world. As I talk about my science, to me, I'm telling people how wonderful a creator we have, what an extraordinary world he's made, and how we can be part of it in our scientific research. And I think that can be very infectious and help our Christians in the congregation. I also think it's very important that we dispel very weak thinking in the churches, which doesn't hold up to scrutiny by those from outside. And I love this quote, you may know it, from Augustine of Hippo. Usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an unbeliever to hear a Christian, presumably giving meaning to the Holy Scriptures, talking nonsense on these topics, and we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people shout vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. And that was written a very long time ago, but it's just as relevant today, I think. If we haven't got church leadership that's talking sense on science, why should the world believe us? I think it's really important. Christians who are mainstream scientists, I think, can play a key role, and I've touched on this, in fulfilling the biblical role of caring for God's creation, providing better crop yields, improved medical care, disease prevention, etc., etc., etc. As a Christian, I feel I'm taking part in God's creative and, in a sense, redeeming process. I think as a Christian and a mainstream scientist, we can play a key role in upholding Christian values in the public scientific arena. And this is the sort of thing, to some extent, that Keith was talking about yesterday. We can provide an informed Christian voice in committees and think tanks concerned with the direction and ethics of scientific research. If Christians aren't proper scientists, how can they influence the decision-making through these public bodies and so on? We can provide a science and evidence-based lead on things like, as we've been talking about, ecology, climate change, in both the Christian and the secular world. And I think that's really important. And then, of course, as for all of us, Christians can be ambassadors for Christ in the scientific workplace. We're all instructed to be ambassadors. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men. And so the Christian scientist has the opportunity to provide a role model of how to pursue science to the highest ethical standards with honesty and integrity. We have the responsibility to give an example of how to give credit to others rather than always seeking to take glory for our own sake. Science can be a very competitive environment, and it's very easy to try and downplay others' roles. And yet, surely as Christians, we have an example of how science should be progressed. The pursuance of truth, not of ego. And I think that is something that I feel as a Christian scientist is one of my roles in the scientific workplace. And now finally, the last slide is really, how can churches better support and use scientists in their congregations? What are some practical things that might be appropriate? I think the first thing says that it's important for churches to recognize that the discoveries of science have an impact on everybody's lives, and this came up very much yesterday. They raise issues that need to be faced by our congregations if we are to be credible. And to be credible and to raise these issues, we have to be informed. And to be informed, you need scientists on these issues. So it's very important that we use scientists in this ways, and I think it's important we use them to engage with young people. And in schools, if churches are attached to schools. Certainly this happens a lot in Bristol, and I really enjoy going into schools and talking about a little bit about my science and how I do my science as a Christian. I was invited into a primary school in Marlow, year 6, and they had some fascinating questions of me, 90 of them sitting in front. And to them, what was key was I was a real scientist. And, and you're a Christian. So we have a real role here to get alongside the younger people and deal with some of the science faith things. Because a lot of young people have bought into, you can't have science and faith. They're in conflict. And as a real scientist, I have the opportunity to dispel that with credibility. I think it's really important to bring the discoveries of science into liturgy, into preaching and teaching as an aid to worshipping God, our Creator. I was glad to see we had that song today, which uses scientific thinking in a way of worshipping God. I think we should learn to do that more, and if you have scientists in your congregations, maybe get them to help in this. What about getting your scientists to, if you've got any, to talk about their work and how science enhances their faith, how their faith has actually been a positive influence in their science. I think that can be really helpful for people. I try and bring into my sermons now when I preach something scientific. When I was giving a sermon recently on Peter and Cornelius, I was talking about a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift there was going from the Jewish world into the Gentile world. And I said, well, paradigm shifts happen in science too. And I talked a little bit about the whole sort of relativity and things like that. And you know, that really caught people's imagination, and it brought science in whilst making a theological point. I think that's something you can do. You can use scientists for outreach, because you can have things like men's breakfasts, you can have supper parties, open lectures, even in alpha courses, having a scattered scientist or two. Very helpful. I have found, I've done a lot of men's breakfasts and supper parties in pubs, and people bring their friends to hear someone who's going to talk a bit about their research and also just say a little bit about why they're a Christian. And the discussions afterwards are fantastic. People enjoy it. And some people do actually come to faith through it, because the barriers, this conflict narrative has been broken down. And I've had colleagues at work who've gone to Alpha and become Christians, because suddenly they've seen the barriers have come down. It's very exciting, but you've got to use your scientists to do that. And then finally on this, you could consider, of course, using the Test of Faith course, which I'm sure somebody's talked about, maybe part of your small group you could program or whatever, and deal with some of the science issues that way. If you wanted to become really bold, you can set up something like this church in Manchester did, which is had a wonder day, and they have practical hands-on science. And it's been very successful, and in fact, Gavin, who's heads this up, is wanting to extend this work. But you can be really imaginative if you've got the resources to have hands-on science and get the kids involved and so on. So that's just a few things. I hope that will stimulate a bit of discussion. And with there, I guess it's time for questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm sure there are lots of questions following that talk. Has anyone? I have one to start with while everybody's thinking. Andrew, now I've visited churches where they said, but there's no scientist in our congregation. What do they then do? Because presumably they can make contact with CIS, or you can rent a scientist.
So that's where CIS is, and in fact Faraday, of course, you've got your list of speakers here, but CIS has a list of speakers all around the country, and depends, you say a topic you want. I know the churches in Sidmouth recently did a whole series on climate, and I was able to recommend 3 or 4 CIS members. But we have a secretary you can write into Christians in Science secretary, and she can make the links. So, and Faraday's got a link. Yeah.
So any others? Yes, there's a question down here. Thanks, Alex.
It's something you mentioned early on about how you approach discussing things, read the Bible and science, and you sort of say they're not incompatible. I'm trying to put myself in the position of someone who says I don't believe in the Bible, and you seem to suggest that you assume the Bible is correct and then sort of push science towards it. And in conversations I've had with my atheist friends, I try to do a sort of, let's pretend the Bible isn't correct and we'll go into your world, and that's a scientific theory, a null hypothesis. Now I'm going to invite you, like your colleague, to come into my world and assume there's a God. And that is a scientific endeavour, and showing that you're willing to go there and come back, I think opens the conversation quite a lot. And I was inspired by going to a talk by Brian Cox, who did seem to do that same thing, and he's the poster boy now, isn't he?
Oh, yeah.
He does the awe and wonder without the God. But actually, from talking to colleagues of his, I happen to know, he's very sympathetic. It's just his persona is, well, we'll leave religion over there. It's that going back and forth thing. I wondered if you could comment.
I think it is really important that we engage. I mean, as a scientist, I'm constantly having conversations that start at the science. Actually, people often would, I think, who are scientists, would often come back to when they're asked the question, well, if you were really pushed, why are you a Christian? I would come back to the resurrection, actually, and look at the evidence for that. Because I think there are always alternative hypotheses. You cannot prove the existence of God. But as a scientist, I look at the evidence. And this is a whole separate talk. This is really apologetics. But I think what one's doing is weighing up evidence and on the balance of probability, which is the best hypothesis. But when I come ultimately to why I'm not just a believer in any God, why am I a Christian? I come to the resurrection, and I think, there's some real good evidence that this guy rose from the dead, and people don't rise from the dead. And a lot of people have never really thought about that, and they've never looked at the evidence. So I do think that's quite a powerful thing to get them thinking about. The other thing I think is the whole purpose and meaning side of things. People do feel they've got meaning. They do feel that there's more than just random collections of molecules banging around in their brain. But when you challenge them from a purely scientific perspective, where does that come from? A lot of people are uncomfortable about that. They just don't like to admit it. So that's another area that I often probe. It's really interesting sitting at conferences. I love doing this when I'm at a work conference and we're having dinner around a table. Every now and then I sort of throw in, well, as a Christian, I think this, and see the reaction. And what I've discovered over the years, I don't know whether someone like Keith would comment the same, but I get a very polarized reaction. Some people will say, that's really interesting, I've been thinking about that. And then you start a dialogue. Other people just get almost angry and shut up and won't, they won't even listen. And I think it's partly because they realize how ignorant they are of that whole area. And so they don't want to engage with it. But I do find it tends to polarize people. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's...
I suppose I'm trying to avoid the polarization.
Yeah, you can't. When people put up that, yeah.
Well, I've ended conversations
Yeah. And hopefully, if you live a fulfilled life, that shows a lot.
No, there's a couple more questions. If we can go back here, and then we'll go to Trevor.
Yes, I agree with everything you said. Thank you very much. But I'd be interested in your view on the sort of flip side, which is that, yes, God is a God of order, and God created the universe in an ordered way. We see the laws of nature. But God is not just a super scientist. God is supernatural. And it's good for scientists to accept that there are supernatural things that go beyond the laws of nature, so-called. How do we present that to our congregations without appearing to surrender?
Now, the first thing this is a very delicate area, because first thing I want to say is, have you ever seen the word supernatural in Scripture? What do you mean by supernatural? I think that's what I'm asking, because what I think you're saying is that there is a spiritual dimension, that God works in a way that we don't understand. I'm always a little reticent when people use the word supernatural as if God's a conjurer messing around with the world he created.
The resurrection is contrary to the normal laws of nature.
Yes, I think there are one or two. Yeah.
They are supernatural. They're not part of what we normally expect.
But I think the area that worries me is that a lot of people use the word very flippantly, and what they're confusing is God answering prayer, which can be through a very natural phenomenon. It can be thing we may not always understand, but to say it's supernatural, it may just be beyond our understanding at the moment. So that's why I don't like the word supernatural. But yes, the dimension. The one example that I really found helpful when dealing with this was one that the president of Christians in Science was talking to us about when he was talking about miracles. And he said, well, of course, God can do things that are out of the ordinary, and he does. He is master of the universe, and therefore he can change things if he wishes. But he says, just like a composer who, certainly until recently, would write in a particular key, a key signature, and the vast majority of notes would be in that key signature. And that's what makes it a coherent piece of music. Every now and then, the composer throws in an accidental, a note that is not in that key signature. And it is done to enhance the piece of music. It isn't there accidentally, in a sense. It's a wrong word. And I think that's where Colin Humphreys would say that the vast majority of time God works in the key signature, and otherwise we couldn't live in this universe. But he is at liberty to contravene those laws if he wishes, but he doesn't do it very often. And there's a very specific reason why he should do it. And I found that quite a helpful thing. But I do find myself worrying when people are constantly expecting God to be a conjurer, and just because I want something, God should change the whole universe for my benefit and be supernatural. That's why I react to it.
There's a very interesting book by Harry Blamires called The Secularist Heresy.
Wait until you've got the microphone.
Sorry. Really helpful book by a guy called Harry Blamires called The Secularist Heresy, where he says that it is a fault of Christian scientists that they tend to rationalize God and present him in a way that scientists will find acceptable. And he gives an example where he was involved, I think it was in Harwell, where there a large scientific congregation in the church, and they needed a new vicar, and he was on the appointment committee. And everyone was saying, well, we need a PhD scientist. And he said, no, you don't. You need a mystic.
I fully agree, and I think mystery, actually there's mystery in science as well. So mystery is part of science. I mean, I think quantum theory is mysterious. So yeah, I think we're really in agreement, but I am very wary that there are some sections of the church that seem to be expecting God to intervene supernaturally all the time. And I'm not convinced that is a biblical perspective. And I do point out to people that the word supernatural doesn't occur in Scripture. Spiritual worlds do, miracles do, but what do you mean by supernatural?
Okay. So, any more questions? We've got a few more minutes. Yes, right next to you, Alice. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've got 3 points I'd like to make, please. The first is that in thinking about widening your list in your early slide, could the council think about artists and poets? There's a big movement now towards science galleries. Wellcome Foundation have some fantastic art produced from their things. That would align with that, and I think probably be very helpful if you had some things that could be put out to churches. That's the first point. Second point is I'd like to just challenge you that I think it was your last slide. Women have breakfasts as well.
Fair point, fair point.
The breakfast is never as good in my tough experience.
You're absolutely right.
Yes, but I'd like to just go a bit further with that. You are accidentally reinforcing something about the whole scientific community. And I think that should be something in churches we really can work at. So, sorry to exact. And the third point was, I've got a sort of an idea that particularly students who you're working with could offer a real ministry themselves if their churches that they were attached to would subscribe for them to the New Scientist, and they then have a responsibility to tell the minister what's going on, because that's one of the things I think that actually freezes ministers. They've got so much to deal with, they just don't feel that they can be up to date with this. And if there was a simple mechanism, well, it doesn't have to be students, any scientists could do that. That might be very helpful.
On your first point, Tom McLeish has just published a book. If you come across his book on I've forgotten exactly the title, but looking at
Poetry of Art and Science.
Thank you. That's the one. And he came and spoke to us in Bristol recently. I mean, so there are Christians. And what's yours is something of wonder and
God in the Lab. We cover wonder and awe and creativity.
Yeah,
we
but
did do an exhibition in our church.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it is happening, but I agree entirely. And I think the more multidisciplinary stuff. There's another book that Andrew Briggs with Roger Wagner did on the penultimate curiosity. That's an artist coming together with a scientist. So that there are books out there doing what you're saying. Mea culpa on the male thing, and I would, it just happens that I have never come across a women's breakfast, but I have been to several men's breakfasts. But I totally agree. I have done other women's events as well. But that's fair enough. Working with students and in churches, this is something we had a £500,000 grant out of Templeton Religion Trust, and it has proved very difficult actually working with students. But I agree, we've really got to get this working. One of the most frustrating things that I find working with some church leaders is they want to be selective with their science too. So I know an awful lot of people who are Christians who are happy with the Big Bang but don't like evolution. And I keep having to say to them, well, you can't really pick and choose your science. I mean, you can in terms of you've got to look at the evidence, but the same sort of processes that have led to hypotheses like the Big Bang are also applied to evolution. You look at evidence. And just because you don't like something is not the reason for rejecting it. And I do find that quite a tricky one to deal with.
So, any more? I think there's one there, and then we'll come to the front. You've got time.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was very interesting to see the Langendorf preparation. I've set up more Langendorfs than I care to remember. But it does make me think about some of the barriers to scientists sharing their work in congregations, perhaps because of ethical issues around the work that they do, or their reluctance or perhaps reticence of feeling that they can speak to a general congregation, or perhaps not feeling that they are as qualified in the theological department as they are in the scientific department. So I wonder if you had any advice on how you might encourage scientists in congregations to sort of step outside of that comfort zone and speak to a general congregation.
I wrote a blog article for Ruth on coming out as a Christian in science. And I think particularly for younger scientists, it's a very difficult issue because you're new to your research laboratory, the pervading atmosphere is definitely agnostic and probably atheist, and you're regarded as a bit of a freak. And it's very challenging. And I think that one of the things that I've found over the years is if I try too hard, remember when I was a PhD student, I felt my role in the lab was to convert people, and it was a disaster. Over the years, I realized that actually if I did good science and used the opportunities to talk just over coffee and just introduce something from, it might be something as simple as, yeah, I was in church yesterday and we had this really interesting talk. Just see the reaction and then gauge. You know, if a barrier goes up, you don't push it, but sometimes it doesn't. It's surprising. One day I was doing an experiment with a research assistant in my lab. We were actually in the cold room, and he said to me, "You're a Christian, aren't you? Why?" Well, it wasn't actually the time to tell him because we were in the middle of experiment, but we sat down for a cup of coffee afterwards. But that you earn the right for those sort of conversations. But I think just the odd, what I often say to people is, look, just throw it in. If you were a football fanatic, you might talk about the match you went to. But don't go around constantly shooting the Bible at people, as if you're, trying to kill them with the gospel, because that won't work. So, but it is, and the trouble is, if people don't start doing it when they're younger, I know colleagues who later in life find it even more difficult because they've lived without being open to their faith, and then it becomes doubly difficult to suddenly come out. So, it's an important one. Other thing is Christians in Science, come alongside other Christians, talk with them, get some advice.
Good. Now, last very brief question before coffee. Thank you.
It's more of an observation, really. I think most people, and that includes a lot of clergy, don't know any science or hardly any science. And that's why they really need scientists helping them. They really don't know the basics.
Mm.
Well, so thank you, Andrew, for helping us to learn some of the basics today.
Cool. Yeah.